this thing on? All right. I want to make part 2 of this series on this article that I read. And really, it's only this last sentence of the article where they denounce Zionism as a racist, imperialist, white supremacist ideology, not a religious movement. Now, I want to make, again, a full disclosure. I am not a Zionist. I'm pretty much on the anti-Zionist spectrum. But nonetheless, I believe in truth. And so I wanted to answer this. This was in an article about anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Zionism at NYU, New York University. So we discussed in the last video, and I think it's worth reiterating somewhat, this question where it says that it's not a religious movement. And that is both true and not true, because it's really not one movement. Zionism is actually several movements, as is anti-Zionism. And so, in a certain way, I wanted to make the point that the religious anti-Zionists really have much more in common with religious Zionists than they do with non-religious anti-Zionists. Obviously, we have our differences with the religious Zionists. I heard of a Kol Koreh that came out in Williamsburg recently about UJO and working together with the Metropolitan Jewish Fund or something, whatever, the Federation, and different factions within the Williamsburg community. That's neither here nor there for right now. Maybe we can make another video about that, although I'd have to actually see the original Kol Koreh, know who signed it, and so forth. But like I said in the previous video, and it's worth watching that again, is that, first of all, Zionism was founded as a secular movement, and it's distinct from pre-Zionist religious movements that sought to settle the Holy Land. I only had about 5 minutes to make that previous video, so that some of these groups that existed before the Zionist movement, you had two essential groups. You had the old Yishuv, which were really the precursors to a lot of today's anti-Zionist communities in the Holy Land. People who went to settle in the Holy Land purely as a religious devotion, without any political or nationalist ideology whatsoever, and also no compromise to their religiosity. These were the creme de la creme, the most pious Jews in the world. And there were two main Ashkenazic factions that came at this time, were the students of the Vilna Gaon and some of the early Hasidic leaders. Both the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon made an effort to go to Eretz Yisrael, and neither of them made it. And we actually talk about that on the last day of Passover, the story of how the Baal Shem Tov tried to go to Eretz Yisrael and was not able to get there. And there was a spiritual understanding of why God did not allow them to make it to Eretz Yisrael, which is very frightening to the rest of us, because those of us who have visited the Holy Land, it makes us have to think twice about the significance and even what exactly is going on, that these great holy men that we revere and have devotions to were not able to visit the Holy Land, and made efforts to do so. And yet we are able to, and we have. And many Jews have settled there. And we have to question, we know for sure that we're no better than them. So then where does this come from? Where, That has to really be the question, spiritually speaking. Is our visit to Eretz Yisrael or a settlement in Eretz Yisrael from the Sitra Achra? Is it from the side of evil? What exactly is going on? But in any event, that's neither here nor there. The point is that there have been religious devotions to the Holy Land that predate Zionism and that were the precursors to the things that are now in opposition to Zionism as religious movements. And literal movements, meaning people got up and moved to show their devotion to God in God's holy land, without any dream whatsoever of independence, of sovereignty. They went to the Holy Land essentially accepting themselves as subjects of the Ottoman Empire at that time, and that was it. But it was a devotion to that particular land, which is special in the Jewish religion, and that is the Holy Land. And we've discussed in other videos what is the significance of the holiness of the Holy Land. And it's a very specific one, that we have laws that apply in the Holy Land that don't apply anywhere else in the world. And that's really what makes it the Holy Land in the Jewish tradition. The next group that came next were the followers of Rabbi Kalisher, were known as the Chovevei Tzion. And I'll be honest, which means the lovers of Zion. And it's an interesting thing, one of my rabbis, whenever he refers to who himself is not a Zionist, when he refers to religious Zionists, he tends to rather derisively refer to them as Chovevei Tzion. Still respecting them as fellow Orthodox Jews, but nonetheless seeing that there's some ideological flaw in that they are, as he refers to them, Chovevei Tzion. But the term Chovevei Tzion is rather distinct from the term that we now are familiar with of the religious Zionist, or the religious nationalist, the Dati Le'umi. Because similarly, the Chovevei Tzion were not necessarily seeking to have any sovereignty. They were going to establish the Yishuv, but to be mechazik the existing Yishuv, but with an understanding. I'd say that the difference between the old Yishuv that predated the Chovevei Tzion and the Chovevei Tzion movement, which are still often known as the old Yishuv, but they're two separate. There's the old Yishuv and the old Yishuv. They're both called Yishuv HaYashan. Yishuv means settlement. Was that there was some eschatology in Rabbi Kalisher's ideology that a lot of the rabbis of that time opposed. So meaning and that's the other major difference. There was no opposition whatsoever to the settlement of the Holy Land by the Talmidei Hagra, the disciples of the Gaon of Vilna, Rabbi Elijah Kramer, or the students of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, the students of Rabbi Israel, the son of Rabbi Eliezer of Mezhbush, the master of the good name, Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. There was, I know of, even though between these two groups, the Vilna Gaon was opposed to the Hasidic movement, to the followers of the Baal Shem Tov in Europe. But I know of no opposition religiously to to either of these groups, the small number of people who went and settled in the Holy Land. Excuse me, let's not lose this thing here. On the other hand, there were, like today's yard site of the Sanzarov. I believe the Sanzarov and the Chassam Sofer and other contemporaries did oppose Rabbi Kalischer's ideas because of the worry of the eschatology that's involved. Because in the Talmud there's an opposition to attempting to realize eschatology through political or other grassroots means, and even through religious means, through too much prayer. And there are stories about other Yeshuvim, the Sephardic Yeshuvim, and certain Kabbalists, Yosef Delarina and others, that are even older Yeshuvim, the old Sephardic, particularly in the Galilee. There were the old Sephardic settlements in the Holy Land that were always, part of the Jewish community, and there were attempts to realize eschatology in those times that failed miserably and led to great spiritual disasters for those who attempted to partake in these things. So you have to excuse me, I'm a little bit under the weather and I'm having a little hard time talking and breathing. But the point that I want to bring out, trying to remember, even though both the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov and the Talmidei Agra were eschatologically minded, it doesn't seem that there was an attempt to change the eschatology, to actualize eschatology through these settlements, as opposed to Rav Kalischer. Zichron V'Rocha is gewein an ehrlicher Yid, but Rav Kalischer, there was a tremendous opposition from the Gedolim of his time against his ideas, because it seemed that he was attempting to realize eschatology, which is forbidden, as it's understood by a lot of teachings of our sages in the Talmud, from various scriptural sources in the Song of Solomon and in Isaiah and other sources. After this came the Zionist movement, which we discussed was a totally secular movement initially. The reason why Herzl, who I don't mind to say Yimach Shemai V'Zichrei, on Theodor Herzl, who was Meshumid, he attempted to, first, as we said, he saw that there was such a thing as anti-Semitism, which is a new idea. Anti-Semitism is distinct from Jew hatred, because anti-Semitism lends itself to the idea of Semitism, meaning that Jews are not hated for their religion, their distinct religion, but because of their racial identity. That is something that they can never, that's immutable. And the truth is, a Jewish soul or a Jewish birth is immutable. One cannot really, through the eyes of Judaism, stop being Jewish. But nonetheless, if someone doesn't believe, they're a heretic. They're outside of the Jewish community. And anti-Semitism, the idea is, which is an old German idea, is that it doesn't matter if the Jews would convert to another religion, they would still be, in the views of anti-Semitism, they would still be worthy to be hated. A lot of this has to do with the fact, perhaps justifiably, that a lot of Jewish people who converted to other religions, not out of any religious conviction, but out of greed and their own heresy and so forth, led to horrific destruction in the world. The sages of the Talmud teach us that Az Sheba'uma Yisrael, the Jews are the most dangerous nation that exists, and that's why God had to give us the Torah to protect us, to protect the world from us, essentially. Otherwise, we could destroy the world. And we see people like Marx, whose parents converted to Christianity, brought the worst destruction to the world. Or even others who didn't apostatize until later, the Sabbatean movement, which is perhaps linked as well. I've seen suggestions that there's links between the Sabbateanism and all the leftist movements, Zionism and so forth, communism, socialism, all of it. These have wrought horrific destruction on the world. So there's some reason for this, meaning that the Jew without Torah is a very dangerous thing. So Herzl, he at first imagined that his solution to anti-Semitism would be all the Jews should convert to Christianity. But when he saw the Dreyfus case, he said he sees that even someone like Dreyfus, who had no Jewish identity, practice, religion, anything, was still falsely accused, and he was a very patriotic Frenchman, yet he was accused of treason against France because of anti-Semitism. And so instead of looking at the Torah that tells us that we suffer in exile because of our sins, and that persecution is a wake-up call for us to return to God, instead of that, he came up with he attached himself to a heretical ideology that we mentioned that Nathan Birnbaum had invented, who later, Zeichet Tzadik Levracha, Nathan Birnbaum later became a real Baal Tshuva, one of the first of the Baalei Tshuva, long before there was a Baal Tshuva movement. And he repented from his great heresy, but he was a horrific heretic. He was a much smarter person than Herzl. And Birnbaum taught Herzl about this movement that he envisioned, that the Jews should have their own country, and that's why, in his dream, that would normalize the Jew, that he would no longer be a man without a country. And perhaps similarly, other groups, the Basques and the Gypsies, Roma people, others, perhaps also similarly hated in this ideology. The idea would be because of their lack of a homeland. Initially, the early secular Zionists dreamed of settling either in Uganda or some other place, maybe get a small place in upstate New York or whatever it is. And they realized they could not attract the traditionalists, who, of course, had a religious devotion or vestigial religious devotion, if they were no longer strictly religious, to the Holy Land. And so that's why they decided later to devote to the Holy Land. In this way, they also attracted certain segments of the religious population, and we'll have to talk about that next time, about religious Zionism, which is indeed a religious movement, and that's different than secular Zionism, which is not a religious movement. But nonetheless, none of these are white supremacist movements at all. That's ridiculous. And we can talk about racism and imperialism. Really, it's not imperialistic and it's not racist in the way that the left calls it, because the left has a different definition of racism than the actual definition of what racism actually is. To the leftists, racism is only white people against colored people, people of color. I guess they're not supposed to say colored people anymore, but they say people of color. I don't know what the real difference is between the two terms. And yet somehow they believe that people of color cannot be racist against white people. That's not racism in the eyes of the left. Of course, it's racism both ways, either way. But also the idea of race in general is racism, and I think that's really, to me, when I say Zionism is racism, it's different than when a leftist says Zionism is racism. When I say Zionism is racism, I mean it's because they believe that Jews are a race instead of a religion. Even the religious Zionists believe that, essentially. And that's a big difference between the religious Zionists and the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox, who reject a racial view of Judaism, although, of course, the religious Zionists recognize the existence of conversion to Judaism, but they also, particularly the more right-wing religious Zionists, try to limit conversion to Judaism as much as possible, as opposed to the liberal modern Orthodox religious Zionists, and most of the Haredi world has a much more liberal approach to conversion to Judaism. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. We'll see you all later.